And the question maybe only left is sort of, and what is a God? Is a God some special kind of magical thing outside the world that creates the world? No, gods, this is what Heidegger thinks, gods are beings in the world that focus the world and shine, as Heidegger would say, with such a radiance that we can act in their light. So let's suppose, to take a funny example, that Marilyn Monroe was a goddess in her time. People say that, I'm a sex goddess, but they don't know what it means. It means that she was the paradigm of a certain style of being a woman, and that women could understand themselves in the light of Marilyn Monroe and see how the world would show up for them in a certain way, and they would see certain possibilities. So a god or a goddess was a paradigm case or a manifestation of a certain way of being and a certain style and a certain world that was so clear and so radiant that people could understand their lives in the light of that person or that thing. I mean, Heidegger thinks in his example that the Greek temple did this. It focused a world, in his language, it focused the world for the people for a certain amount of time. These gods aren't eternal, and they aren't creator gods, and they don't sort of explain the whole universe, but they do save people from meaninglessness. Well, Nietzsche was the first to talk about the death of God in the gay science, and it means, according to Nietzsche, that a certain understanding of God no longer has a grip on the culture. There are still people who believe in God, and but fewer and fewer. It doesn't sort of organize the culture the way it once did, where cathedrals were the center of things and where reading the Bible enabled people to understand what to do. And the question is, what happens in a culture like ours that has built everything on the idea that there is one creator God, and everything in the culture was built into it, as Nietzsche said, so that if that should collapse, lots of our ethics and our understanding of what it is to be a human being will collapse with it. And that, what Heidegger calls the ontotheological view of God, namely the God who is a being, who is the cause and a ground of all beings, that's the God that's become implausible, this unified ground of intelligibility and ethics and meaning. When that goes, where are we in the culture? Well, there are several things that can happen that interest me. When I teach about this, I teach Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky as the two people who tried to save the essential message in Christianity by disentangling it from philosophy and from science. And it starts with Pascal saying the God of the philosophers is not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's already trying to get Christianity away from this one source, creator, ground of everything God. But it only gets worked out in Kierkegaard, where it turns out that what matters is having an unconditional commitment, and whoever you have this unconditional commitment for is your savior, because they enable you to get yourself together and not be in despair. And Jesus is important because Jesus is the savior. That is, he's the first person who showed us how to make unconditional commitments. And God the Father just drops out, the ontotheological God. Kierkegaard uses Jesus' quote, "He who has seen me has seen the Father," and says we don't need and we don't have access anymore to that kind of ontotheological God. We've got the incarnation, and the incarnation shows us the unconditional commitment. They're all incarnation people. That's the first way you get out of it. Pascal says we have Jesus. Jesus shows us how to be a human being without despair and without pride, and how to live in our contradictory nature and live it, be most alive to it. For Pascal, you can't be happy, I don't think. The point isn't to be happy, it's to be deeply alive to what it is to be a human being. and not despairing or proud. In Kierkegaard, Jesus shows us the possibility of unconditional commitments. In Dostoevsky, whenever he talks about God, he always says, what I loved most was the slanting rays of the setting sun. The rays are what's important, not the sun. And the rays are the symbols of the connectedness of all creatures. And what the deep truth in Christianity that Jesus showed us was that we should love everybody and we should feel responsible for everybody and ask forgiveness from everybody. This is all worked out in the Brothers Karamazov. But the important thing to Dostoevsky is that it's a way of life, Christianity, namely this way of life of love and connectedness. And it's not a relation to some being like the sun, sort of outside the world, that you should, that gives everything meaning. And for Dostoevsky, another important thing is that you have to save Christianity from physics and chemistry. Kierkegaard didn't have that problem. So Dostoevsky is very clear that you can restate, and that's what's happening in the Brothers Karamazov, all the Christian sacraments, baptism, crucifixion, resurrection, incarnation, all of them get explained in existential terms in such a way that they don't conflict with the laws of physics and chemistry. And Dostoevsky even considers neurons, which had just been discovered, and said, suppose everything we did was caused by the wiggling of the tails of these little neurons. That wouldn't change anything in our world, of the human world, where love and forgiveness and everything is the meaningful thing. So the first hope is that you might be able to save Christianity by stating it in a non-philosophical, non-ontotheological, and non-scientific way, and just save the existential truth in it. But if that doesn't work, then the next fallback position, which Melville, for instance, had in Moby Dick, is to rediscover polytheism, where there was, for Homer, a plurality of gods, and gods weren't sort of real, how will I put it? Well, let's say what they were. When Aphrodite was around, you were in a world suffused by erotic love, and things showed up for you as attractive or unattractive. When Aphrodite was around, Helen ran off with an attractive foreigner, Paris, and left Menelaus. When the war was over and she came back, and presumably Hera, the domestic goddess, was in charge, nobody blamed her or anything. They said, well, that was Aphrodite. She was in the world of Aphrodite. But now we're all in the world of Hera, and she was a gracious host and a good hostess and a good wife, and served great dinners to visiting people like Odysseus. And there was a plurality of worlds, and in each world, people had an identity. They didn't see. The problem is to avoid meaninglessness. If the Christian God goes, it may look like everything is up for grabs. Nothing has authority for us, and we have no identities that we can count on anymore, because if we can't make unconditional commitments anymore, if we don't believe in that kind of eternity anymore, then it looks like the meaning of our lives is constantly up for grabs and reinterpretation. But for the Greeks, when you were under Aphrodite, there was authority, namely what was important was erotic love. Or when you're under Hera, what's important is domestic love. Or when you're under Apollo, what could be important was, I don't know, intellectual clarity or something like that. You can live in these various worlds. In each world, there is meaning. And in each world, you have an identity. And in each world, the God has a kind of authority. So it seems to me polytheism is a possible thing that our culture might come back to. And the hints of it, I think, are in this interest people have in angels. Angels are sort of interesting in that they're not like this ontotheological, one unified creator God. I don't know much about angels. I haven't had time to read books about angels, but I have a feeling that it's a kind of confused grope for a new kind of spirituality in which there will be individual beings they could be human beings, they will be human beings really, who focus worlds and give meaning to people's lives for a while. And for a while, one, while the people are in their worlds, and two, while these gods have power, and they will lose power, like different generations of gods in Homer had power, and then some new generation came along, and it had power.